in the Garden of Eden, before the temptation and the fall, before that whole encounter with the serpent, there was a command given to Adam and Eve, which was that they should work the garden and keep it. This is actually really significant. One, it tells us that in as much as Eden, right, the Garden of Eden is this image of paradise, of sort of this idyllic picture of the human person in perfect harmony with each other and with nature, right? That image of paradise is still one that involves work, right? Often, I'm sure we've all had terrible jobs that we hate, and there's so much work that is toil and bitterness. But there is also the greatest fulfillment and joy that you get out of life is when you actually have a good work to do. When you have something you're good at, something that is, challenging, but yet also in which you're succeeding at, right? And in which is actually somehow producing more good, right, in the world, right? And this is really oftentimes the reason we hate so much of the work that we do and we have, stupid jobs is because though it doesn't seem like the work we're doing is producing any tangible good in the world. Because even if a job is very hard, if there's a sense of it has purpose and meaning, right? It's producing something of goodness, we can endure a whole lot of hardship and difficulty and sacrifice for that. Aristotle's definition of happiness is unimpeded work, right? And that's kind of funny. That's not what maybe you would think at first, right? But this idea of and so we see this idea of man having a purpose, right? That man is, and this is important, is not just that he is there to take the creation that God gave him as a gift and to maintain it, right? But this is especially true, and especially the Eastern Fathers in the theology that they teach, that man is a co-creator with God. That, and this is the best way to think of it, is that creation was made incomplete and then given to us to finish. Now what that does is it takes the status and the worth of the human person and it elevates it to the level of God, the level of co-creator with what we have. And so this work, and so what do we see then in the gospel story we read? We see Jesus coming to Peter to give him work, right? He's fishing, right? There's work there, but God has something even better in store for Peter as he wants him to be fishers of men. And so he gives him this call, right? And what does Peter do? At the very end of the gospel reading, he drops everything, abandons everything for this call, right? To be a fisher of men. For this new work that's set before him, he's willing to abandon everything else because now he has a work, a labor, a purpose that's more meaningful and more significant that is going to produce. And there's good in fishing and giving people food. There's something very basic and honorable about that work, but there's something even loftier and more noble about what Christ is calling him to, because recalling the words of Christ, right, man cannot live on bread alone, right? That our fulfillment and our life is more than just satisfying the material and basic and immediate needs of our life, right? That something even more profound is what we're called to. And so one of the ways to look at what does it mean to be saved? What does it mean to have an encounter with Christ, right? In many of the cases, what it means is the person gets a new purpose, a new task, a new work to do. And having having this purpose, having something meaningful to do with your life is liberation, right? It's freedom from meaninglessness. It's freedom from shallowness in your life, and being free to actually be able to fully be what it means to be a human being. We also see that there is one of the things that's necessary is Peter had to do a few things, right? In order to see this miracle of the fish, in order to receive this calling, right? He had to be obedient. He had, and by obedience here, I mean trust, right? He had to trust God. They had been fishing all night, and Jesus says, put the boats out a little bit and try again. And we recall Peter's response, which was, Master, we've toiled all night and caught nothing, but nevertheless, we will go out. That is a fantastic line to live by, right? One way I think to understand that is, part of it is trust the process with God in your spiritual life. You're going to, again and again and again, without fully seeing the end, without having the picture completely clear, without having all the evidence that you might want in order to feel kind of safe and sure about what you're going to do, you're going to have to trust God. And this really isn't any different than what we have to do with each other in relationships. We have to trust each other. We have to, right, put the boat out into the deep with one another. There has to be risk there in some way. And what we find is that when we're willing to trust like that, to trust like Peter, and that requires some humility, it requires courage, right? It requires belief in that person to take that risk. And he puts out nonetheless. So often in our life, maybe we're doing our prayers or we're doing our fasting, or we're in a relationship with someone and it's difficult and not going well, and we're trying to figure out, there's a temptation to sort of end that relationship and give up on it, or to neglect our prayers, or to not fast very much because we're not seeing the results, or because it's difficult, or because we've had a track record of these things and they haven't been producing any fruit. We haven't been seeing any results. We haven't been getting what we want. And yet what we have to do is we have to say, nevertheless, I trust you. I'll put out into the deep. When he does that, this is a common theme that shows up through the Gospels, which is sort of the superabundance of the good news, right? It happens all the time where it's like that Christ doesn't just give you what you want, he gives you way more than you expected or could imagine for your life. This is what these two boats overfilling and sinking from the weight of all these fish in them represent, is that the work, the purpose, the plan that God has for each of us and for all of us is more than we could imagine or expect. It sometimes isn't even what we might want, but it's absolutely, when we find it, what we know we always needed. And to get there, you have to put out into the deep. And what is the deep? That is the risk, right? That is the sacrifice that's necessary to get to that point where you can have the encounter with God, where you can get the sign, right, of a fish sinking your boat. And then this, I think, is one of the most beautiful parts of the entire gospel story that we read today, is that Peter, man, what a beautiful heart Peter has, falls on his knees and says, I'm a sinful man. I shouldn't be in your presence. He says, I'm not worthy of this. This is the universal experience of what it means to be in the presence of God, to receive the gift and the grace that God gives us, is that whether it's in prayer or in receiving communion or in some other great act of love in which God acts through the hands and life of someone else near us, is that we have this, when we encounter God's grace, his love, it's an overwhelming feeling of undeservedness. And that is exactly how it should be. Because the love and the grace, the plan that God has for us, the gifts he wants to put into our lives, the ways he wants to change us, are a thing we don't deserve and have not earned and never can. But that's exactly what love is. And that feeling, the authentic response to that is one of humility, openness, vulnerability, and surrender. And when that happens, when our hearts respond to God's movement in love in that way, it finally allows us to open our hearts up and to make room inside of us for the living God. In the same way that Mary, when she said yes to the message of the Archangel Gabriel, made room in herself, in her womb, for the very body and blood of God himself. Doing that, making that room for the other, that requires, this is what love always requires. It requires this absolute surrender of our own ego to make room for someone else. And we find that what love does of this surrender is that the gift is boats of fish overflowing and sinking those boats. That's how much we get back in return with this kind of love. But it requires the response of Peter, of surrender and trust, of gratitude in the face of such an overwhelming blessing. And Peter, when he receives all this, and then Jesus gives him this, says, I will make you a fisher of men, he does what's completely appropriate, which is he realizes that this gift of love, this work, because love is work, is what it is. That this is a fantastic gift, that this is the precious pearl, and that this is worth sacrificing everything else for. This is what's meant, that moment where Peter surrenders. This is the first shall be last, the last shall be first. This is what that is. This is this great reversal of the gospel, that when we abandon everything in love, we get everything back and more. Glory to Jesus Christ. Glory to God.